Hello and welcome to the SANDAG Specialized Transportation Grant Program Cycle 13 Call for Projects Stakeholder Workshop. First, I would like to ask our interpreter to explain how to access live and Spanish interpretation. So Giovanna, please go ahead.
Good afternoon. To use the interpretation feature, please scroll to the bottom of the Zoom screen where the meeting controls are. Click on the interpretation icon, the world, and select English as your language. If you're joining through the Zoom mobile app from a cell phone, tablet, etc., please press the ellipsis, then interpretation, and then choose your language. Finally, click on mute original audio to not hear the original Spanish low in the background. Buenas tardes. Para hacer el uso del servicio de interpretación, por favor desplazarse a la parte inferior de la pantalla de Zoom, donde aparecen los controles. Haga clic en el icono de interpretación, donde está el globo terráqueo, y seleccione español. Si está utilizando la aplicación móvil de Zoom desde su celular, tableta, etc., presione los puntos suspensivos, luego interpretación y luego el idioma. Si no desea escuchar el audio original en inglés en el fondo, por favor seleccione silenciar audio original. Gracias. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Giovanna. So my name is Zachary Rivera, and my colleague Ali Vasquez and I serve as the program managers of the Specialized Transportation Grant Program, or STGP. We are glad you are here and look forward to hearing your input. But first, let me share a few housekeeping notes. This meeting is being recorded, and the recording, along with the presentation and notes summarizing the feedback we hear, is all anticipated to be posted to the STGP webpage in about a week. We welcome your questions throughout the workshop. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom to pose your questions, and time permitting, we'll answer them during the workshop.
Thank you, Zach. So thanks for that great introduction. We wanted to make this a really interactive and engaging workshop for you all. So we have a number of questions to get your feedback. And we also wanted everyone to be able to see each other's answers. So we're going to use a platform called Mentimeter. You can use your smartphone or your computer to participate by going to menti.com and typing in the code of our presentation on this slide, which is 31578409, or scanning the QR code before you. So what I'm going to do is just leave a few moments here so that folks can log into Menti, or load Menti, I should say. And then we can get started with our first question. Great. And again, you can use your smartphone or your computer to participate via the Menti feature. So I will go ahead and get started with our first question. So our first question is an easy one, and it is how you would describe yourself. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Okay. Good. So we can get kind of a sense of who is with us today and get practice utilizing the Mentimeter. The options that we have listed here are whether or not you're a writer, a service provider, or an STGP grantee, or somebody else.
Ali, I think we have a couple questions which, in the Q&A about the code taking them to the grant award question. Another one about, just so you're aware.
Okay.
And one about the question about raising maximum grant awards is another one that someone saw. Just
okay.
Could you mention the Menti code again? Somebody could ask about that.
Sure. The Menti code is 3157-8409. So I will go ahead and try and fix any issues that folks are experiencing. Just give me one moment here.
And I've just added the Menti code to the chat for everybody.
I see that we got one answer, so hopefully it's working for folks now. I think.
Yeah, I think some people are having an issue. Maybe somebody has said that their phone says the presenter hasn't changed slides. Again, I think they're seeing the first question is the grant amount.
Okay. Apologies, everyone. I'm going to do my best to fix this on my end. Can folks type it in the chat instead at this time? I think that would be a good way to get a sense of the audience here while I get the Mentimeter up and running.
Just so everybody knows, a couple people had said they exited and then rejoined, and it went to the beginning. It showed the new question. So if you haven't done that, maybe that's a possible option if you're having trouble. And it looks like people are also seeing that the chat is disabled. I don't know if that's something that we can rectify here on the back end. Okay, I'm seeing that the chat now works. So those of you who may have had problems with it before, if you could enter that answer to that question into the chat, should be functional now.
All right, so I know from the results on the screen that we do have one grantee. I see a few service providers as well from what I'm seeing on the chat. I see a transit planner, a writer, that's great. It looks like the Mentimeter is working for some folks, so that I'm glad to see that. It looks like the Mentimeter is working for folks, so I do apologize if you entered it in the chat and the Mentimeter. Technology sometimes has issues, but I'm glad it's working for folks now. We've got 9 grantees, 7 service providers, 1 writer here, and then someone else has joined as well. Seems like mostly we've got already existing grantees that Zach and I probably know, and then a lot of service providers as well. Okay, good. Okay. Good. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide. And I hope that when I move to the next slide, it will solve some of the Mentimeter slide question issues too. So the next slide is another question here. And so if we could all try again to use the Mentimeter, and if that's not working, we could try the chat. But the question for the Mentimeter and for all of you is, did you attend the STGP Cycle 13 kickoff meeting that was last October? And again, the code for the Menti is 3157. 8409. All right, so I'm seeing that a lot of you did not attend our last kickoff meeting. Oh, and now look, just loading the results here. Many of you did as well, so it's good that we've got kind of a split here between our audience members.
I see, Ali, that there are a couple people where the slide's not changing. So if you're having problems, you maybe want to put that in the chat for your response as a backup. That would be great.
Yes, for folks that the Menti is not working for you, I'm so sorry. I'm not sure why it's working for some and then not for others. But I've tried everything I can on my end on the browser as well as the PowerPoint slides as well. So if it's not working for you, the other option here is you can just go ahead and type in the chat as Ben suggested. Good, so it looks like we've got a little bit of a split here, but many of you are kind of first timers for learning about the STGP Cycle 13 kickoff. So we're glad to have you, and go ahead and get started here.
Perfect. Thank you, Ali. And again, apologies for the Mentimeter issues. We tested it earlier and it worked fine. And I think we love technology when it works, but when it doesn't, it's unfortunate. So thanks for bearing with us. So let me share what's in store for us during our time together today. We'll provide an overview of the STGP and the Cycle 13 anticipated timeline, summarize the development of the Cycle 13 call so far, describe the existing criteria and seek your input, and wrap up by discussing next steps and how to connect with us. But first, let me set the stage by describing our region's changing demographics. According to data from the American Community Survey, about 11% of the region's total civilian non-institutionalized population was estimated to be disabled in 2021, or about 333,000 people. Additionally, SANDAG estimates that 16% of the region's population, or about 519,000 people, were 65 and older in 2022. By 2050, SANDAG forecasts that the population 65 and older will increase to about 763,000 people, or about 22% of the total population. As the older adult population is expected to increase by 47% by 2050, SANDAG and other agencies have an opportunity to really address the changing specialized transportation needs of our region. So it is against this backdrop that specialized transportation becomes even more important for our region. So what is it? To share our definition, we define specialized transportation to mean a broad range of transportation-related services to improve mobility for older adults and individuals with disabilities when fixed route public transit is insufficient, unavailable, or inappropriate.
Thank you, Zach. Now we'll go into one of the ways that SANDAG is addressing the specialized transportation needs of the region, which is the Specialized Transportation Grant Program. Since many of you are familiar already with programs during the kickoff meeting when we introduced it in October, we'll only provide a little bit of a brief overview now. So the current STGP goal is to improve mobility for older adults and individuals with disabilities by delivering effective, equitable, environmentally responsible, and coordinated transportation solutions in our region. Through the STGP, we provide funding through the Federal Transit Administration Section 5310 program and the Transnet Senior Mini Grant Program. Eligible applicants are nonprofits and local governmental agencies. While there are similarities between both the funding sources for STGP, there are some differences as well. The Section 5310 program administered by SANDAG funds grants that improve mobility for older adults 65 and over and individuals with disabilities in urbanized areas of the county. Meanwhile, the Senior Mini Grant Program funds grants that focus on older adults 60 and over throughout the entire region. So there are three eligible grant types under the STGP. One is mobility management, two is operating, and our third is capital. Mobility management and operating grants are eligible under both the Senior Mini Grant and the Section 5310 programs, whereas capital grants are only eligible through the Section 5310 program. That's our federal program. Additionally, the grant term for vehicle grants ranges from 5 to 7 years, depending on the type of vehicle, whereas the grant term for the other STGP grants is typically around 2 years. So about every 2 years, SANDAG holds a competitive process, or what we call a call for projects. And that's to distribute the available STGP funding that we have. Since the program started in 2006, we have awarded over 63 million through 12 call for project cycles. We currently estimate that there will be about 9.2 million available through this call, the cycle 13 call for projects. And the forecasted increase of the funding is due to the bipartisan infrastructure law, which bolstered our Section 5310 federal funding. To decide how this funding should be distributed, SANDAG sets criteria which will be used to score proposed applications and prioritize them during the competitive process. The Independent Taxpayer Oversight Committee and the SANDAG Transportation Committee are responsible for providing input on the criteria that is ultimately approved by the SANDAG Board of Directors. Recommended criteria are informed by stakeholders to ensure they are responsive to the needs of the region. The criteria may also be informed by best practices from other regions, staff expertise, and recommendations from performance audits and existing criteria. So are there any questions on what we've covered so far? Based on this, you can go ahead and type them in the Q&A box and we can try and answer some of those live.
So Ali and Zach, we do have a question from Jesus. He wants to know if they're eligible through this grant to apply for a vehicle purchase to transport volunteers to education and outreach events.
That is an eligible purchase, but it needs to provide service for what we call our target population for the funding source, which are older adults 65 and older, and people with disabilities, or people with disabilities, I should say. So that is eligible, but only if the vehicle is being used to service that population. Great question.
Okay, we do have in the Q&A, let's see, asking to review grant for capital items is from which grant, asks Martha.
So for capital grants, those can be funded through our Section 5310 program. That's the federal source of funding.
And
Okay.
if I may to jump in, our capital grants are accessible vehicle purchases, as well as contracted transportation services. Thank you.
Yes, contracted is when you contract out for a service to provide transportation for the target population.
And then we have another question. Could this include funding to study or evaluate ADA accessibility for bus stops?
Yeah, I could take that one. Currently, the criteria or the eligibility doesn't include funding for planning or especially for bus stops. So that would not be an eligible project.
Maybe we have a couple more, two more. Maybe we'll answer these two and then move on.
Yes.
So first question is, we're a nonprofit that services individuals with disabilities and need a shuttle to help with pickups and drop-offs. It sounds like we would be eligible for Section 5310. Does it matter that we do not serve the general public?
Great question. That is okay. That is an eligible expense for the Section 5310. So you would be allowed to apply for funding through the Section 5310 program.
Okay, and then we have from Eric, will this grant be on BidNet Direct again? They had some false requirements on the last cycle that caused us to be disqualified.
Yeah,
Zach?
we're going to be using BidNet again, and encourage you to reach out to us directly if there were any issues about that, what you talked about. We can try to troubleshoot for this cycle.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben, for monitoring the questions, and they were all great ones. And I hope that as we go along, we'll be able to answer any more of your questions through our slide deck here. Okay, so I'll go ahead and move on to the call for projects introduction from Zach.
Yeah, wonderful. So let's just now recap where we have been in the development of the Cycle 13 call for projects for the STGP. So SANDAG began the Cycle 13 call process back in October with our kickoff meeting, which was attended by more than 50 stakeholders, including many of you. Following this, we presented to SANDAG Mobility Working Group, the SANDAG Social Equity Working Group, and 3 other regional stakeholder groups focused on specialized transportation. We also engaged stakeholders through eBlast, social media, and the STGP webpage. Through all these efforts, over 100 stakeholders were engaged and more than 100 comments were received. So from this initial feedback, 5 themes on the region's specialized transportation needs emerged. Availability, such as expanded hours and service areas, flexibility, such as on-demand service quality, coordination among providers, as well as affordability. We also asked stakeholders what, if anything, should be changed to improve the STGP goal. While some thought no changes were needed, others suggested that references to dependability, affordability, and on-demand service be included. A summary from the initial stakeholder engagement is on our webpage. And based on this input, we think that references to dependability, affordability, and adaptability are best suited for potential refinements to the criteria with no change to the program goal proposed, and we'll get to that a bit later. We also analyzed 2 recent studies about the National Section 5310 program. In 2021, the National Aging and Disability Transportation Center published a Section 5310 program compendium, which highlighted best practices. In 2022, the Transportation Research Board published a study on the administration of the Section 5310 program throughout the country. The study found that, quote, the level of need for transportation, particularly for services that enhance mobility for older adults and individuals with disabilities, is so great that the program cannot meet demand and applications routinely surpass the available funding. The study also found that while the Section 5310 program is often oversubscribed, program managers have generally worked to streamline administrative processes rather than reduce the number of grantees. So since the Section 5310 program is nationwide, we can explore what other regions are doing with respect to their Section 5310 programs and criteria. So to this end, we conducted a benchmarking analysis by identifying 8 regions that have comparable Section 5310 programs to SANDAG's and comparing their selection criteria. So from the 9 regions studied, including San Diego, 53 selection criteria were found, which we narrowed down to 9 categories. We then looked at how commonly each criteria was used. Coordination was the most common selection criteria found in 8 of the 9 regions analyzed, including San Diego. Overall, we found that the themes of the criteria we used for our last competitive cycle were consistent with those of the 8 other regions studied. We also compared the simplified criteria by the average weights across the regions. We found that coordination was not only the most prevalent criterion, but also given the most weight by the selected regions. So performance measures and service effectiveness was the criterion given the second most weight. The complete analysis is available on the STGP webpage. And before we go on, are there any questions on what I just covered or any other questions so far?
Okay, so we do have a few more questions. Jesus asked, do all of the volunteers have to be older or disabled?
Sure, I can take that one. To be very clear, what we're looking at is the target population is older adults and individuals with disabilities who are being transported. The volunteers can be any age, any disability status.
Okay, and then Rachel asked 5310 only in urbanized areas, correct? So the unincorporated would not have access.
Yes, so the 5310 program that's administered by SANDAG is for the urbanized areas of San Diego. The rural areas, those areas are covered by Caltrans. So Caltrans administers the Section 5310 program for the rural areas of San Diego.
Great. Let's see. Just in terms of, I'm just going through here. We have some more comments. Do you want to reserve the comments for later, or should we go through those?
We can, if there are any other questions, let's take questions first, and then we can come back to any comments later.
Okay. There was somewhat of a question, I think, on can on-demand be defined at some point during the presentation? Maybe that's something we can address now or come back to later.
Sure, I can address that one now. So for the STGP is geared towards transporting older adults and individuals with disabilities. It's typically a demand responsive service, but that doesn't preclude on-demand options.
And then another question about how is coordination defined as a criteria, meaning what exactly?
Very good. Thank you for that question. So coordination really encompassed for a lot of these regions the degree to which agencies coordinated with one another to deliver service in a more effective way. That was one way. And another way is the degree to which applicants really aligned their proposed grants with a regional plan, what we call the coordinated plan. It's basically a regional plan for specialized transportation and other transportation options. So those are the types of things that we saw when we were doing the analysis. And again, that analysis is on our webpage if you want to check it out.
So if somebody in the chat said, I think it was Martha. So if I'm interested in my rural unincorporated area, I do not need this workshop.
Well, I would say that if you're looking for senior mini grant funding, that is countywide. And that's for older adults, the target population, older adults. If you're looking at just like say, getting a vehicle to serve the target population, then I would refer you to Caltrans for the rural areas. But you're more than welcome to stay and listen in and learn too.
Maybe we can take one more here from Lisa. That works for you guys.
Yeah, one more.
Yeah, sorry. Still need more clarification on definition of on demand. Within 1 hour or 24 hours?
Yeah, so for the STGP, we don't define on demand. So those definitions are really more, I would say, geared, and Ben, you can speak to this as well, geared toward more the access for all grant program. So we don't have a threshold for on demand, and we accept on demand and demand responsive services as being eligible.
I'll just add that just separately for access for all. Right now it's within 12 hours for that program. So which will be addressed when we have future workshops there. And any other questions, we can get back to you at the next opportunity for Q&A.
Perfect. So that brings us to today, where we can collectively focus on the existing criteria and think about possible enhancements that best serve the region's needs. So what was the criteria used last time? So I'll just spend a couple minutes on here describing the existing criteria. So overall, there were 8 criteria categories used in the STGP Cycle 12 call for projects for a total of 100 possible points. So first, we had applicant capacity and experience. This evaluated whether applicants had experience in successfully managing grants, transportation-related projects, and services for older adults and individuals with disabilities. It also looked at the financial stability and capacity of applicants, including sufficient staffing, data management, internal controls, and financial management. Second, operational/implementation plan. This measured the level of detail applicants used to describe how they would be effective providing their proposed service. For example, designs with innovative concepts, staff experience, technology, as well as safety protocols. Next, stewardship of public funds and assets. So for non-vehicle applicants, this evaluated whether only necessary and reasonable costs were proposed and if sufficient matching funds had been secured. Applicants with vehicle and other equipment projects were evaluated on how well they would use the assets over the grant term, how robust their procedures were to safeguard the assets, and the level of matching funds committed to the project. Next was need and equity. This evaluated whether the service would indeed aid older adults and individuals with disabilities and their specialized transportation needs. It also looked at how the service would benefit those that need it the most, including historically underserved populations, as well as respond to diverse populations, including individuals with limited English proficiency. The 5th category was coordination, which assessed how applicants would coordinate with other agencies to address service gaps, avoid duplication, and enhance service delivery. The 6th category was environmental responsibility, which evaluated how much the service would promote healthier air and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Next was proposed performance, which evaluated the number of hours of service, which with 40 plus hours a week receiving full points. For operating and contract transportation services, projects were evaluated on their cost per one-way passenger trip. For mobility management, vehicle, and other equipment projects, applicants were assessed on how they would provide clear, appropriate, and quantifiable measures on their cost effectiveness and overall effectiveness of the proposed service. And last but not least was performance monitoring, reporting, and outcomes, which evaluated how well awarded applicants would monitor the service, track client data, and strive for continuous improvement. It also looked at how well applicants and eventually grantees would receive input from project beneficiaries and use this input to inform service delivery and how they would measure outcomes, demonstrate impact, and advance ultimately the STGP goal and objectives.
Okay, so I'm hoping we could try this again, the Mentimeter. And so if this is another slide, so you can try and get into Mentimeter, and you can enter the code 3157-8409. You can use your phone camera to access the website, or you can just open your internet browser and type in menti.com and enter the code that way. So what I'm going to do is just kind of pause and let folks do that again for a moment. I think one thing I'm going to try to right now is, because I know some folks are having issues, I'm going to try and restart my PowerPoint program really quickly. So if you see me kind of log in and log off, that's what's going on. So one moment while we try and get Menti to work for everybody.
I saw a comment in the chat. Do you want us to log off and start over? I think that was just Ali that was logging out and starting the PowerPoint over. So
yeah.
I think, yeah.
If you're already in Menti, your browser might have already responded to it, and you might already be in it. I hope that helps. But I think the reason why we have that slide too is just so in case folks closed out and want to re-enter, they can do so as well. And I'm going to present the slide again, and maybe Menti will work this time. But as always, the chat is available as well. Okay, good. So we'll go to the next question here. So we would like to get a pulse on what you think about the existing criteria. So our question, okay, it looks more promising than the first time. So I hope it will work this time. So just to get a pulse on the existing criteria, as I mentioned, the question is, do you think these criteria help us identify the most qualified proposals? And again, we invite you to participate via the Mentimeter, and the code is 3157-8409. And you don't always need the QR code. You can just type in menti.com to your browser, and then enter the code 3157-8409. So it looks like folks are already answering, seeing a lot of yeses for the criteria. Some folks are unsure. We don't have any no's in the group. Could be good, could be bad. Good. Well, it seems like a majority of you here think that the criteria will help us identify the most qualified proposals. I hope that the Menti's working for folks. I think it's working on my end. Looks a lot more promising than the last time. So thanks for your patience. All right, and so now we have another question. We're going to dive a little deeper into the existing criteria. So for this Mentimeter question, you should see each criteria category listed and a sliding scale from 1 to 5. And with the sliding scale, you should be able to hit 1, which is strongly disagree, or 5, strongly agree. And you can slide the bar to represent how important each category is to you. So for example, if you think applicant capacity and experience is extremely important, then slide the bar all the way to the right for number 5 and to indicate that you strongly agree. You can also skip criteria categories as well. And once you're done, just make sure to click or tap the submit button at the bottom. It looks like folks already have been responding. Let's see. Interesting results so far. I'm seeing a lot of people think that applicant capacity is very important, as well as I see the second one is operational implementation plan and need and equity. A lot of people think that equity is very important to consider. Great. Wow, this is really interesting to watch the scales move.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting as well. And please let us know in the chat if you're having issues with Menti or provide answers there if you are having trouble. We want to make sure we capture your input.
Excellent. Yeah, we've got, ties here. Need and equity, operational implementation plan, and applicant capacity and experience here. And then trailing along, we've got environmental responsibility and performance monitoring and reporting outcomes. Very interesting. Great. Okay, well, I'll go ahead and move on to the next slide here. And next slide here is what other criteria should we consider besides the ones that we just listed for you? So we're just curious about what should be considered for the next competitive call. So for example, you might say affordability and dependability are important, or adaptability may be important. So this is intended to be open-ended, so you can just type in words in Mentimeter, and it's supposed to generate a word cloud for us, hopefully, and you can submit multiple responses. Okay, I see affordability here. And if any of you see something on the screen that is already displayed that you agree with, you can feel free to type it again, and it'll make the word bigger so you can portray that you think it's really important. So the bigger the words, the more important it is to the folks listening in now. And that's data we would really love to collect from you guys. I see number of beneficiaries, adaptability, efficiency, eligibility management, capacity, reliability, and convenience are really important for folks. This is great. And I see quality was added as well. Service area. And as always, you can put it in the chat, put your ideas in the chat too, if you would like, or if having any trouble at all. Well, it seems like affordability is very important to the crowd. Unique demographics. Service satisfaction, I like that. Service satisfaction and writer satisfaction, those two are related. Those are good ones. Flexibility, that kind of goes to the service type. It could. Great. Well, we love seeing these answers come in, and feel free to continue to answer them, provide answers in the chat if Menti is not working, but this is really great and provides us with really great feedback for what to consider for this next call. So I'll go ahead and move on to the next slide here. I'll pass the mic to Zach.
Thank you, Ali, and thank you all for participating in our last question. I was excited to see all the different options that you guys were coming up with, so I appreciate it. So another policy consideration is the minimum and maximum grant award amounts. So currently, for the Section 5310 program, the minimum grant funding an applicant can request is $50,000, and the maximum grant funding an applicant can request is $1.2 million. These minimum and maximum amounts are currently the same for the senior mini grant program. So for example, if an applicant requested $1 million in senior mini grant funding for mobility management grant, then it could request no more than $200,000 in senior mini grant funding for an operating grant. So what are some of the pros and cons of the existing policy? One benefit of this policy is that it provides applicants flexibility to request Section 5310 funding for one or several accessible vehicles. One of the reasons that $50,000 was set as the minimum grant award is that it has historically taken about that much funding, combined with matching funds to purchase an accessible minivan, which is the cheapest vehicle available through SANDAG. Another benefit of this existing policy is that there's consistency across both funding sources, so it is easier for applicants to understand. One benefit from a grant administration perspective is that there may be fewer grants that require monitoring and administration with relatively high maximum grant awards. A downside, however, is that it can decrease the number of small-scale services, which can reduce the diversity of grants, including the geographic distribution of funding. In the last competitive cycle, 4 agencies were awarded senior mini grant funding of the 9 that applied, and about 3/4 of the available senior mini grant funding was awarded to 2 agencies. Another con of the existing policy is that it does not set a minimum award by grant. So for example, hypothetically, an applicant could technically request $50,000 for an SMG operating grant and $1,000 for an SMG mobility management grant under the existing policy, which would create kind of an undue administrative burden to implement and monitor such a small grant. Next slide. And can we actually go back a couple slides, Ali? One more, forward one more, couple more. Perfect. One more, please. Oh, interesting. Well, I do want to share that kind of in this vein, before we get to this Mentimeter question, possible changes could include setting the Section 5310 minimum grant award to $50,000 and setting the senior mini grant award to $100,000. So we'll get to that in a little bit. So in this question, we're looking at should we allow applicants to match Section 5310 with senior mini grant and vice versa? And I should share for context that the required minimum match is 10 to 20% for vehicle grants, depending on the vehicle type, 50% for Section 5310 operating grants, and 20% for all other STGP grants. Okay, so it looks like so far we have most saying yes, we should allow applicants to match Section 5310 with senior mini grant and vice versa. There are a few that say no, and then there are some that 5 say not sure or no preference. And also, to be clear, this is something that is currently allowed under existing criteria, where one can match one against the other for the same grant type. Okay. So a lot of you are saying yes or not sure, at least for those that have responded. Interesting results so far. Thank you.
Okay, I think with that, we could move on to the next slide.
Perfect. Okay. And just to reiterate here, so another policy consideration is the minimum and maximum grant award amounts. So currently for the 5310 program, the Section 5310 program, the minimum grant funding an applicant can request is $50,000, and the maximum grant funding an applicant can request is $1.2 million. These are exactly the same for the senior mini grant program. So for example, an applicant can request $1 million in senior mini grant funding for a mobility management grant. Then it could also request $200,000 in senior mini grant funding for an operating grant. That would get you to that 1.2 million maximum amount.
Great. I'm glad that you went over it, because I noticed we did have a question about the max amounts as well.
Perfect. So again, there are pros and cons to the award ranges now. So what are some of these? One benefit of the policy is it provides applicants flexibility to request Section 5310 funding for one or several accessible vehicles. And one of the reasons SANDAG set the $50,000 minimum is that it's historically taken about that much grant funding combined with matching funds to purchase an accessible minivan, which is the cheapest vehicle available through SANDAG, that is. So some agencies only need one vehicle to meet their riders' needs, whereas other agencies may need a larger fleet. So this large range accommodates the varying needs of applicants. Another benefit of the existing policy is that there's consistency across both funding sources, so it is easier for applicants to understand. Like I said earlier, one of the benefits from a grant administration perspective is that there may be fewer grants that may require monitoring and administration with relatively high maximum grant awards. A downside, however, is that it can also decrease the number of small-scale services, which can reduce the diversity of grants, including the geographic distribution of funding. And so for example, hypothetically, an applicant could technically request $50,000 for an SMG operating grant and $1,000 for an SMG mobility management grant under the existing policy. And again, that would create an undue administrative burden to implement and monitor a grant that's $1,000. So that's one of the cons of not having a minimum award by grant. So in that vein, possible changes could include setting the Section 5310 minimum grant award to $50,000 and setting the senior mini grant minimum grant award to $100,000. Additionally, we could also modify the maximum grant funding an applicant can receive to be more proportional to the amount of available funding in each funding source. As a reminder, the estimated amount of available Section 5310 funding is $6.4 million for this cycle, and the estimated amount of available senior mini grant funding is 2.9, that is 2.9 million this cycle. So with this approach, we could raise the Section 5310 maximum grant awards to 1.6 million per applicant and lower the senior mini grant maximum grant award to $800,000 per applicant. Again, possible changes. This is not set in stone, and this is what we're looking for feedback on. So here's a visual representation of one possible change for the Section 5310 program, raising the maximum grant award per applicant from 1.2 to 1.6 million, as shown in the bolded text. And then again, for the senior mini grant program, if we can go to the next slide, we could also set the minimum grant award to 100,000 and lower the maximum grant funding an applicant can request from 1.2 million to 800,000. So let's talk through some of the pros and cons of the possible changes. So by establishing minimum grant award thresholds, we can minimize the administrative burden of smaller type grants, such as the $1,000 grant scenario I mentioned earlier. And by scaling the maximum grant award per applicant to the amount of available Section 5310 and senior mini grant funding, we can better balance the need for larger and smaller grant sizes without significantly increasing the total number of grants that require monitoring and administration. These changes can allow for more grant diversity, not only in the types of grants, but also in the geographic distribution of funding, especially for the senior mini grant program. On the other hand, these changes could negatively impact senior mini grant applicants that would want to request between 800,000 and 1.2 million. Additionally, these changes could negatively impact some applicants that match Section 5310 funding with senior mini grant funding if this policy continues. So for example, if an applicant requests 1.6 million for a Section 5310 operating grant, it must provide 1.6 million in matching funds because Section 5310 operating grants require a 50% match. However, with the proposed changes, that applicant could receive no more than 800,000 in senior mini grant funding. So it would have to provide at least 800,000 in additional matching funds outside the STGP. So if you want to go ahead, Allie.
Yeah, so with all that said, we wanted to get your input about what you think about these possible changes. So we're curious to see what you think. So for this Mentimeter question, we're asking, should we raise the maximum grant award for Section 5310 or lower it for senior mini grants? And so we'll give you a few minutes to answer this question. And again, to answer the Mentimeter questions, you go to menti.com and you use the code, or if you had it already open, you can just answer using that. There's also the chat option as well. I see some comments already in the chat. One person said, I would highly recommend that you do not increase 5310 section to 1.6 million. Organizations that really need grants do not need grant funding that size. That's one comment. This would cut out eligibility for smaller grassroots organizations that have been started to meet underserved populations, such as those with disabilities. And another comment that we've had is it would appear that smaller organizations are at a disadvantage with raising minimums. The senior mini grant program has historically been inclusive of the mini request. This person is asking a question of whether we're moving away from this if we implement this type of change. And
sorry.
Go ahead, Ben.
I was just going to say in the Q&A,
Mm-hmm.
somebody mentioned that they're not sure if the attendees understand this question on Menti necessarily, possibly. So
I see. Okay. Well, I'm glad that folks are voicing that and then putting answers in the chat. Zach, do you want to repeat anything else for this question so we can clarify for folks?
Sure. Yeah, so right now there are minimum and maximum grant award amounts. And what we're looking at is what can we do to increase it or decrease it for both funding sources? So what this question is asking is, should we raise the maximum grant award for the Section 5310 program from 1.2 million to 1.6 million per applicant, and likewise lower it for the senior mini grant program from 1.2 million to 800,000 per applicant? And also for context, in the last cycle, we had 9 senior mini grant applicants. Of those, 4 received funding, and of those, about 75% went to about 2 applicants. So just some context.
Thank you, Zach. Thanks for the clarification. It looks like folks really appreciated that based off of the chat. There's one comment that organizations absolutely need larger grants. One person said, don't raise it for 5310, should lower it for senior mini. Saw that in the chat as well. So it looks like some folks said, yes, raise the max award for Section 5310 and lower it for SMG. Some people said, leave it as is. A lot of people said raise it for both funding sources. This is probably from, comments that were, or research that Zach and I have already done, where everybody wants funding, right, for this important subject. One person said lower it for both funding sources, and others are unsure. Right, and I think the Mentimeter, really reflects what we're seeing in the chat, where it's confusing. I mean, it's a little hard to understand. So this is why we're bringing it forward now, trying to talk to folks about it early and trying to clarify it as much as possible. Okay. Yes. Yes, yeah, I see comments in the chat that the answers may be, you know, a little skewed because folks are not understanding. So we'll definitely keep that in mind. Thanks for that comment. Okay, so I'll go ahead and move on to the next. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about electric vehicles. I know a lot of our existing grantees have been interested in this. I would like to note that applicants will now be able to apply for electric vehicles. So as some of you know, applicants can request Section 5310 funding for the purchase of new accessible vehicles. SANDAG buys these vehicles on grantees' behalf through a purchasing cooperative to secure advantageous pricing and ensure compliance with federal requirements. And this cooperative, we're happy to announce, now offers electric vehicles, and these will be available during the Cycle 13 call for folks. So SANDAG offers 3 types of accessible vehicles through the cooperative: cutaway buses, transit vans, and minivans. So you can see them displayed here. The cutaway buses can seat up to 16 passengers, whereas the transit vans seat up to 9 passengers, and the minivans can seat up to 6 passengers. Currently, the only electric vehicle cutaway buses and transit vans are only electric vehicle cutaway buses and transit vans are available, but the EV minivans are on the horizon and could be available for the Cycle 13 call. We just don't know yet. The base of the gas-powered minivans is between $62,000 and $66,000. And in general, the EV models are about twice as expensive as the gas-powered counterpoint parts at this point. The total vehicle cost additionally includes like taxes, fees, and any optional features. And accessible gas-powered vehicles require a 15% cash match, whereas accessible electric vehicles require only a 10% cash match. So that might be an incentive for folks. Okay, so we have one last Mentimeter question for you all, so I'll go ahead and start that. So based on this information on electric vehicles and your needs, we're curious about the level of interest for accessible electric vehicles. So for our last Mentimeter question, we're asking how many electric vehicles would your agency apply for? Submit 0 if your agency isn't interested in vehicle funding through SANDAG, and not applicable if you are not here on behalf of an agency. So this is just really helpful information to help us plan for these type of purchases for the next call. For a lot of folks, it's not applicable, but there is quite a bit of interest. I see 6 answers saying that they would purchase 1 or 2 electric vehicles. Okay, great. So that one's kind of a quick question to help us wrap up here with our Mentimeter polls. But thank you so much for participating. So now I'll pass the mic to Zach.
Thank you, Ali. So thank you for providing your input through Mentimeter and bearing with us on the technological issues. So of course, this is just only a snapshot of your input. And of course, we got more responses in the chat, which we greatly appreciate. So I encourage you to reach out if you want to elaborate on any of your responses at a later point, if you think of them. I'll share how to do that in a moment, but just this Mentimeter feedback gives us a lot to work with. So to wrap up this workshop, let's discuss where we go from here. As mentioned earlier, we anticipate posting the workshop recording, presentation slides, and a summary of feedback on the STGP webpage in about a week. In early March, a draft report of the fiscal year 2024 Transnet Triennial Performance Audit is expected to be released, which may also inform the Cycle 13 criteria. Then in the March to April timeframe, we expect to return to SANDAG working groups and other stakeholder groups seeking further feedback on the criteria. So with all this feedback, we anticipate presenting refined criteria to the Independent Taxpayer Oversight Committee and the Transportation Committee at their May meetings for discussion and possible action. Depending on the outcome of those meetings, we plan to present the criteria to the SANDAG board in May or June, teeing up the release of the Cycle 13 call on July 1st, which would then open a 90-day application window.
All right, thank you, Zach.
Wonderful, wonderful. So with that, thank you for attending this workshop and taking valuable time out of your day on this wet Wednesday to provide feedback, which is crucial as we can continue to develop the Cycle 13 call. We encourage you to visit our webpage, sandag.org/STGP. There you can learn more about the program, review the literature review, benchmarking analysis, and existing criteria, and submit further feedback via the Cycle 13 comment form. You can also email us at grantsdistribution@sandag.org with questions and comments. Lastly, we ask that you take a quick survey to provide feedback on the workshop via the link we'll provide in the chat. And your feedback is greatly appreciated. So we have a few more minutes remaining, so I'll turn it over to Ben to see what other questions that came in during the workshop.
Okay, thanks, Zach. We'll just move over to that spot there and go back in time slightly. Okay, and my apologies if it's been a little delay getting back to you on this, but from what I can tell, here are some of the questions. Felix asks, can we apply for more than one type of grant, i.e. operating, mobility management, capital?
Yes.
Yes.
Definitely.
That's
Okay.
a yes, yes.
Great. Can you clarify the older adult starting age? Is it 65 years or older? Asked Derek.
That's a great question, Derek. So it depends on the funding source that you're applying for. For Section 5310, that's federal funding, so they define it as 65 and older. If you're applying for senior mini grant, that's 60 and older. Thanks.
Okay. Rebecca asks, is it possible to see last year's question about environmental responsibility? I remember that question being challenging for us.
Yeah, Rebecca, and I thanks for the question. I put a link to the evaluation criteria, and the criteria really kind of match the applicant questions. So I would encourage you to check that out. It's on our webpage under the Cycle 13 header.
Felix asks, is the evaluation criteria expected to change?
Well, that's where you guys all come in. So it'll be informed by the stakeholders' feedback that we hear. It'll be informed by performance audits and just staff expertise. So it's an iterative process. So I won't say it won't change, and I won't say it will change. We're still early on in the process.
Tony asks, what is the match amount for 5310?
So for 5310, the match amount is 20% for most grants, for mobility management grants and capital grants. For vehicle grants specifically, it's 15%. For operating grants, it's 50%.
Okay, Someone asked, how are those limits set or decided? I think they're talking about the min max 1.2 million.
Yeah, so those are set based on what are the needs of the region. As I mentioned earlier, we do have a minimum set based on how much it costs to acquire one of the cheapest vehicles available, a accessible minivan. In addition to that, we also set a minimum just to make sure that there are, we're not awarding like $100 grant that requires a lot of administrative time and effort on both SANDAG and the grantee. So we definitely want to make sure that there is a minimum. In terms of the maximum, that has vacillated from, changed from cycle to cycle. And the last cycle, it was 1.2 million per applicant per funding source.
Another question, why is $50,000 the minimum?
Perfect. And I think I just answered that in
Yes,
terms of, yeah.
Sorry, my
all
attention's going different places. What is the logic behind potentially raising the specialist or SMGT to $100,000 minimum? Was that answered?
Yeah, sort of, but I can do a better job clarifying here. So the idea with that is to the amount of effort it is to administer a grant, seeing if we can raise that a little bit. During the last cycle, we had only one applicant that requested that amount or lower, and most of our applicants requested more. And again, for senior mini grant, it's over 2 years, so 50,000 per year is the current minimum, or could be the current minimum.
Okay, another question, is the match for any of the grant programs in cash only?
Great question. So for Section 5310 funded vehicle projects, that is cash only match. But other grant types, it can be in kind as match. There are other options available, but for vehicles, it is a cash match.
Yeah, volunteer hours are also available for match for the operating and mobility management grants.
Next, raising from 1.2 million to high. Okay, that was just clarification about the question. Do you carry over funds if they are not all distributed? Rebecca asks.
Okay, sure, I can take that one. So we either roll over funding to the next competitive cycle, or we return funding back to the FTA, the Federal Transit Administration, for the Section 5310 program.
Nancy asks, are you seeing that smaller agencies are being left out and parts of the county not being served because of the amount requirements?
Yeah, so I'll just cite the data that we have. At least for the last cycle, nearly all the requests for funding for the Section 5310 program were fully funded or partially funded. For the senior mini grant program, that's where we saw different impacts. So we had 9 applicants, 4 were funded, and of those, 2 received about more than half of the funds available.
Let's see. Some comments here. Do you have, Nancy asked, do you have figures on the costs of fueling gas-powered vehicles versus having your own EV charging station?
Now
that I do not know. I don't know if
yes, I wouldn't know
does.
either. I would suggest maybe talking to other operators if you know them, because that's SANDAG, we administer the funding, but we're not the operators, so that would be a hard question for us to answer.
And I would also say that we have a relationship with the California Association of Coordinated Transportation, or CALACT, and we buy vehicles through them. And through them, there are vendors, and the vendors typically have more experience with all things vehicle procurement and implementation. So they would be a great resources to reach out to.
Looks like we have about 3 minutes and 3 more questions. What about electric infrastructure, charging ports, solar panels? Are those eligible capital expenses? Asked Rebecca.
Yes, so that's something that we are looking at. We haven't made a determination one way or other. One thing that we're looking at is whether there would be certain federal requirements that would be triggered by having that, because it would qualify as a public works project. And so we're working through that right now. We don't have an answer at this time.
Okay. In the chat, I'm seeing from Lisa, can you share how you select the evaluators? What level experience do they have with specialized transportation?
Yeah, so currently we have a questionnaire that potential evaluators submit to us as part of our screening process. And these are evaluators external to SANDAG. And the experience can be, or expertise can be varied. It could be related to specialized transportation. It can be related to grants. It could be related to providing service for older adults and individuals with disabilities. It's very broad. And so when we look at that, we don't have like a certain year of experience threshold. We just look at it as in the aggregate. So that's where we are.
Another question: how would a carve out for fact impact the amount of funding available?
So that is something that our transportation committee is looking at, or will be looking at their February 16th meeting. So if this topic is of interest to you, I would encourage you to attend, participate in that meeting. We will also be sharing more information about that topic via email to stakeholders, so be on the lookout. And yes, if there were a carve out for the CTSA through Section 5310 funding, there potentially could be less funding available for other applicants. But that is a policy consideration that the Transportation Committee will be taking up. And it might not, because depending on what that Transportation Committee recommends, and ultimately what the SANDAG Board of Directors decides.
And Zach, I just wanted to add to that too. When SANDAG goes to the Transportation Committee on February 16th, we'll also be talking about specialized transportation funding as a whole from SANDAG. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because we're going to have a really great map on service areas, and there was already a question about the service areas that is funded through the STGP. And so I would hope that those maps provide insight to that person asking about the service areas and whether it's impacted by our funding. Thanks.
We have 2 more questions. We have time to take 2 more.
All right, I think we can do it.
Okay, let's try. Would you consider establishing or reestablishing minimum maximum funding per project versus, or in addition to, per funding source?
Sure, we can definitely consider that. I think one of the reasons why we had per applicant is try to consolidate, make it easier, but and more efficient. But we're definitely open to looking at it per project and trying to make it as easy and understandable as possible.
Okay. Actually, I think there was just that one question. So I think we are all set in terms of questions from the chat and from the Q&A.
Okay. Well, again, thank you everyone for attending. Hopefully you got something out of it. And to reiterate, please reach out. Maybe this stimulated a thought, or you'll noodle it a little bit later and have other thoughts. Please reach out to us. We're open to your feedback through grants distribution at sandag.org. We also have our webpage where you can provide comments via our comment form. Again, this is an ongoing process, and again, really appreciate your input. So thank you very much.
Thank you.